Well, good evening, everyone, for our final Chifley Conversation of the year with Sean Kelly. I'd like to welcome you all tonight. And first of all, I'd like to start with a welcome to country. Those of you who have attended before will know that the Chifley Research Centre is located on the land of the Ngunnawal people, and I'm speaking to you tonight from the land of the Dja Dja Wurrung people in the Kulin Nation. And Sean is joining us from the land of the Gadigal people, I believe. So we'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all these lands and the lands from which all of you are joining us from tonight, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to welcome Sean tonight. For those of you who don't know, and I suspect most people will know, Sean is now a columnist for various 9 newspaper outlets and a regular contributor to the Monthly, in addition to his contributions to a range of other publications. And he has, of course, been an advisor in past lives to both Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard. And most recently, he's produced a very good book called The Game, and that's what we're here to talk to Sean about tonight. Just before we start, I'd like to say to people, we'll have a bit of a conversation. We'll run through some questions, and then we'd like to invite some audience questions. If you could direct your audience questions to the Q&A function on the webinar rather than the chat. That way we can keep a track of them a bit more easily, and we'll get to them reasonably soon. So Sean, thanks very much for joining us tonight. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
You are widely quoted as saying that you were a reluctant starter for this book, that when you were first approached, it was something that you perhaps didn't want to tackle because you thought the subject might be a bit boring. What made you change your mind?
You are right to say I'm widely quoted on that, David. I think after at this point in a book tour of sorts, you begin to feel a little bit like one of the politicians I critique for saying the same things over and over and over. You begin to feel a little bit like you're not sure whether you're drawing on the truth any longer or simply something you've said 100 times. It is true, I didn't really want to write this book to begin with. And in fact, the whole thing was a bit of an accident. And I have actually only said this in one other forum before. Even the first article that I wrote was a bit of an accident. I got a call from, I happened to be in Melbourne, and I happened to go into the offices of the Monthly, and I I'd written a daily column for the Monthly for a while. I was speaking to the editor, and the editor said, "Listen, Sean, we've asked David Marr to write a profile of Scott Morrison, but if Marr doesn't want to do it, will you?" And I said, "Sure. I mean, of course, very happy to take whatever David Marr leaves behind for the rest of us." So I ended up writing this profile of Scott Morrison. And writing this profile was a really instructive exercise. It was a really interesting and stressful thing to do because it was right at the start of Morrison's prime ministership, and you just don't know when you're writing about somebody at that point, one of two things can happen. Either everybody can catch up to you and reach the same conclusions that you've reached before your piece is published, and that didn't quite happen. And then the second thing that can happen is just you end up being entirely wrong. And very fortunately for me, this piece that I wrote ended up being, I think it pinned Morrison fairly accurately, and that's what led to a publisher coming to me a couple of years later. And they said, "Do you want to write this book about him?" And I said, no. I thought that I had said everything there was to say about Morrison in that initial article. And I thought about it, and I couldn't see a way to make Morrison interesting. I didn't find him interesting myself, was the real barrier. And so I talked to a bunch of other people to check my instincts, to see if I was making the wrong decision in turning down this book contract. And people agreed. People from the right and left of politics said much the same thing. They said they just didn't find the man interesting. It wasn't that they all disliked him necessarily, nor that they didn't respect him. They just didn't find him an interesting specimen. And this was interesting. This was a perversely interesting thing, that everybody held the same uninterested view of him. And so I began to think about why that was. He was a guy who we should have been interested in. He came to the prime ministership in unusual circumstances. He'd won an election that nobody expected him to win, and still we didn't seem to know much about him. We didn't seem to want to know more about him. So I began to wonder how he had deflected our attention for so long, whether that was intentional, whether it meant anything, and what it might say about us that we were content to rest where we were, that we were content to say, well, we don't know much beyond a few superficial traits, and we're happy to leave it at that. And the book, in a way, is a quest to answer some of those questions.
Okay. So given where you've got to with that and posing some questions about us, have you actually ended up with a book that's more about us than about Morrison? And perhaps
look, in
that's
some
the
ways,
thing that kept your interest.
well, yeah, that's right. And in some ways, yes, but the answer, when I say yes, that draws upon an analysis of Morrison. And the analysis of Morrison is that he is fundamentally, beyond anything else in politics, a performer. He is performing all the time, and that draws on a family history of performance, a history of being a child actor, and also a man who worked in marketing of a sort, advertising, tourism, helping design a major national tourism campaign, an advertising campaign, which again is about performance, if you like, a certain type of storytelling, a certain type of image making. And if you are somebody who is performing, if that is what you are bringing to public life more than anything else, then that performance is not going to be an accident. That performance is going to be directed at appealing to the people you need to appeal to. And so Scott Morrison tells us a lot about ourselves because the nature of his performance is crafted to appeal to us, to appeal to Australians as a nation. And he has succeeded in that to a reasonably large extent. He is Prime Minister. And so, yeah, I think that is obviously about Morrison, but it is very much about us as well.
Yeah. Now, you say he's succeeded. As a reader of your book, I would say you actually believe he succeeded par excellence. Now, dare I mention the name? Mark Latham is famous for saying, or one of the things he's famous for saying, and one of the more pleasant things he's famous for saying, is that politics is show business for ugly people. But in essence, there's a bit of truth in that, rather than just pure malice. In that, it does require a bit of showmanship. It does require a bit of the acting. But does Morrison, not only does he take it further than many of his predecessors, but has he taken it to an extent that we should be seriously worried about where our body politics has got to?
I mean, of course, that is 100% true. Mark Latham was right about it being show business. Paul Keating was right when he talked about needing a bit of vaudeville. And you do. You know, a politician who doesn't have that is going to falter. I think that the difficulty comes when that performance becomes unmoored from reality in a couple of respects. In the book, I talk about the beginning of television beginning to take over politics. And you see this in the late 60s. And this young guy called Joe McGinnis writes this book. It spends 31 weeks on the New York Times bestselling list. And it's about the advertising campaign that helps elect Richard Nixon. And he quotes Roger Ailes, who will go on to head up Fox News and end up in enormous trouble for multiple sexual harassment allegations against him. And when he's a young man, when he's working on this Nixon advertising campaign, he says, this is it. Politicians are going to be performers forever after. You know, what is important now is what they pretend to be, what they perform as being, not what they actually are. And it was this tremendously prescient comment. And then over the next few years, what you see is the practitioners begin to accept this wisdom. So the insiders, the politicians, the staffers, the journalists all get this. And you have the writer Joan Didion talking about the ritual in the Michael Dukakis campaign of Dukakis throwing a baseball around on the tarmac while he's waiting for his plane to refuel. And she says, you know, this is essentially a meaningless set of events that everybody watching knows is meaningless. It is there purely to provide camera footage. It doesn't mean anything in itself, but outsiders wouldn't see that. Outsiders still don't understand that. And then I think you fast forward to today and you get to the point where everybody sees that. And I think everybody knows now on some level that politics is performance, and politics is a bit of a game. And the problem with that is you've had politicians who are becoming more and more skilled at performing, and journalists and the public who have become more and more accepting of the idea of politics as performance. And what that has meant is that politics has become distance from reality. So we've forgotten that it has consequences a lot of the time, I think. And so that's the first sense in which I think it's a real problem when a politician is all performance. And Morrison, in a sense, is just the extreme example there. He's not alone by any means, but he is an extreme example. And then the second way in which I mean this, that this unmooring from reality is a problem, is a politician who employs vaudeville, a politician who understands the show business aspect of politics, until quite recently, I think, has largely been doing so in order to achieve an end. Keating absolutely believed in vaudeville, spent a long time in his office, something I wish modern politicians would do more of, spent a long time in his office crafting the lines that he would use. They didn't come off the top of his head. He knew that he needed to capture people's attention with colourful language, but that was there to achieve an end. It was there because Keating had certain things that he wanted to achieve. And the difficulty, I think, I have with Morrison, and you can say this of Johnson and Trump in various ways, and politicians in other countries, I'm sure, is that he doesn't have anything he particularly wants to achieve. I think, and I know I'm not the only person who's paid very close attention to Scott Morrison who believes that. And that's a very strange point for our politics to have reached, because it means that, you can tie it to many trends. It means that the professionalization of politics has reached this point where it is just about politics. It's become so professionalized that it's not about doing things anymore. I think that's a bleak point for our politics to have reached.
Yeah. To play devil's advocate, to offer a bit of a counterpoint, what would you say to the proposition that perhaps it's not that dire, and in fact what Morrison is the first genuinely small c conservative prime minister that we've had since Menzies, and that as a small c prime minister, for a person of his mindset and for people who might agree with him, they might not want much change, and therefore they might not want much vision. They just might feel quite comfortable, and therefore it may be no great sin to be as complacent as he appears to be.
Yeah, look, I think there is something to that. I think I am no expert in Menzies, but I guess the point I would make about Menzies as a differentiating point is that there was I think a philosophical world view, and in terms of founding a party and then giving a party a backbone at the very least of rhetoric on which to rest, and a real focus, I think, on the middle classes and what the middle classes both needed and wanted. I think that there was a worldview there. Morrison probably, you're right, David, I think shares that worldview in many ways. It's more of an instinct, I suspect. So I think he would head the same ways, but I'm not sure that he would articulate them in any coherent way. And you can tell that from his language. His language, in his big set piece speeches where he has tried to knit philosophical ideas together, they are all over the place. There are big contradictions. There are sentences that don't seem to make that much sense. I don't think that he's thought these things through in any great detail, certainly not to the extent where he's sculpted a coherent philosophy. But I think the other element there is, because there's that lack of a coherent philosophy, I genuinely don't think that there is anything that he would fight for. And I can't see anything in his prime ministership that he would fight for. Now, you can make an argument. You can make an argument that no change is something to fight for, but even there, I don't think I see that in Morrison. I think as soon as there seems to be a sense that people want him to do something else, he goes in that direction. He never sticks. I think that's a crucial point.
At risk of dwelling on Menzies, I'm wondering what you think of the proposition that Australians might be historically particularly susceptible to politicians who behave in this manner. For my sins, I've been rereading a bit of Donald Horne recently, and interestingly, some of his revised chapters on Menzies in The Lucky Country, in editions that came out after Menzies had well and truly departed as Prime Minister, he sounds very much like you. He describes Menzies as a political ham, as someone who threaded his way through public life, unbending a little hit, this is to quote Horne, a little here, a little there, thereby fooling scores of otherwise sceptical and hard-headed, what Horne describes as men, but he probably means people. But it resonates with some of your conclusions. Here's someone who trails a bit of the coat in way, it's almost like a pointless picture. There's a little dot every now and then to convey a larger impression, but if you go back to it, it's just a dot.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, I don't know if Menzies was quite the dot, but the Horne comparison is very interesting, because of course I draw on Horne quite heavily in this book, and his analysis. I mean, it's remarkable reading that book today. It is it's remarkably prescient, or it's remarkable how little Australia has changed in its fundamental attitude. I think that I write in my book, there are so many passages in it that feel as though they could easily be written today. And I do think that strain is something Australians are susceptible to. And of course, Horne makes this point, and I make the point drawing on Horne. And the reason is that we are this is an easy country for many people to live in. We are, at this point, an incredibly rich country, incredibly rich. We are a peaceful country. We are a country that is isolated in many ways, which is incredibly helpful in lots of situations, including the recent pandemic. We have an incredibly good healthcare system. And I think together those elements, as well as Australia's natural beauty, means that means that it's very easy for many of us to think that nothing needs to change. But of course, that's not true for everybody in Australia. And I think often we make the mistake, or many people make the mistake of assuming that is true for everybody. And I think that is one of Morrison's mistakes. And I worry that attitude can't stay in place over the next century or even the next couple of decades, because I think that we are heading into some very turbulent waters. But absolutely, I think Australia is prone to that complacency. And, you know, Abbott used to talk about getting sport off the front pages and replacing it with politics. And he was drawing, I think, Menzies before him. And Morrison said something very similar in the first weeks after the 2019 election. He said, you know, people can get back to their lives now, forget about politics for a while. So there is that strain in the Australian character. I think the conservative side of politics has very deliberately played to that strain. And I can understand why. I mean, listen, the point you make about Menzies, I think, is really interesting in the sense that that it does point to how much conservatism has shifted and how much it's shifted under Howard. You know, Howard's conservatism was of such a different strain from the conservatism before him. It was a very activist conservatism. And, you know, Morrison's this odd hodgepodge in a way. You know, Howard and his generation, in a sense, muddied the various tenets of conservatism in a similar way to, I think, the way that Blair and Clinton muddied the tenets of the left, and everything got mixed up a little. And so now you have Morrison, who I don't think believes in very much at all, but will happily, you know, spend enormous amounts of money on groups that he thinks deserve money, or groups that he thinks will vote for the Liberal Party. It's not. I mean, Menzies probably did believe quite genuinely in small government in a way that I don't think Morrison, you know, gives two hoots about whether the government is small or large, really.
So, does Morrison represent a trend within the Liberal Party to retreat from neoliberalism?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. I don't think he does, and it's not to say he couldn't. He could represent that, and perhaps if he wins another couple of elections, which is very plausible, then perhaps he could take the party in that direction. My sense right now, at least, is that the Liberal Party is in a trickier place than that. I don't think there is a core of the Liberal Party that is departing from neoliberalism. I think it's more that there are two sides of the Liberal Party, the moderates and the kind of arch conservatives heading towards the far right. And they are both frustrated with Morrison, is my sense at the moment. Not to the extent that they decided they'll lose the election and all-out war has broken out. Definitely not that. But I think there is definitely some frustration on both sides of the Liberal Party, sensing that Morrison is not really with either of them. So I don't think Morrison is leading a strand of the Liberal Party that will follow him ideologically in coming years. But you know, give it time, and anything could happen, of course.
Okay, well, that's a useful point at which to segue to the election that's about to hit us. And how sustainable is this Morrison approach to politics, and what does it portend for next year?
Sorry, what was the first part of that question?
Well, how sustainable is this Morrison approach to politics, and what does it mean for the election?
I mean, I think one of the things I write about in the book is, as I was saying, this performative aspect to Morrison's approach to politics. And there's a game-playing aspect of treating it as all tactics and strategy. And one of the things I think he did very cleverly was create this ScoMo persona. And it's not entirely false, not at all. I think he is, in some respects, exactly who he purports to be, even if the superficial traits like loving rugby league and cooking curries are themselves a little manufactured. I think they attach to something which is true in its fundamental character. But at any rate, he created this ScoMo character. And I think one of the big questions leading into the next election is how robust is that model? Because I think it was robust enough to get him through the 9 months between becoming Prime Minister and going to the voters in 2019. But I do think that character has worn quite thin over the last 3 years. Now, maybe people don't mind. I think a lot of people at this point are tired of Morrison. I think they're disillusioned with him, but I do, as I said, I think there is still a great acceptance that politics is fundamentally performance. And so maybe he doesn't end up getting judged very harshly on that. In some senses, this is Labor's challenge, I think. If their argument, and it is an argument they're making, is that Morrison is flim-flam, then they need to present a contrast to that. They need to say, well, we're the serious option. We're the option who stand for something and have serious policies. I'm not. I just mean in a political sense. In a political sense, if you are attacking your opponent for something and saying this is the problem with them, you need to present its opposite as one of your strengths. I don't think Labor is there yet. I think you've maybe seen some hints at that, but obviously when you ask, how sustainable is that model, a crucial factor in how sustainable any political model is the strength and skill of your opposition. And I don't think we have a clear sense of that yet.
Right. Just to return to what you've just described as flim-flam. Flim-flam doesn't necessarily mean soft. And you point to a number of examples of, Morrison behaving quite harshly. So I'll just go to a question from Julie Grint, who's asking, well, there's been, Morrison's racism, cruelty to asylum seekers, and she says misogyny. And she asks, where does that come from? And where does that fit in?
Well, it's a tricky question. I don't think I use any of those words specifically. I think
you don't. Julie does.
I think that Morrison has. I think that one of his difficulties going into the next election might be that he has systematically alienated a number of groups. It depends on your view of elections in a way. Elections can be determined by a vibe, if you like. They can be determined by a national mood. Sometimes there's a national mood for change, and sometimes there really, really isn't. And sometimes they're determined more by by demographics, adding up the demographics, if you like, adding up the people in electorates. Each election is very different from every other election. And I think that those types of factors, if you like, or those types of perceptions that some people have of Morrison have an effect in a couple of ways. One is that adding up of demographics, if you like, who are frustrated with Morrison, who dislike him, who don't feel that he is interested in them or cares about them. And I certainly think that the return of gender equity as an issue in the last few weeks is a difficulty for Morrison. It's a real difficulty if it returns next year. And then the second difficulty there, I think, is that one of the problems for Morrison is this perception that he doesn't have empathy, that he's not really capable of thinking beyond his own quite narrow experience. And I think that that's one of those things that, it's not a political slogan. It's not something that's going to appear on banners at any point, but it's the type of thing that just slowly adds up into a perception problem for a prime minister. And so I think those are the two ways in which that politically becomes an issue.
Just to pick up on that, assuming that the Liberal Party's research is good, and if that sort of phenomenon is occurring, where Morrison's behaviour or his modus operandi is starting to grate on people, what incentives, other than just straight responses to market research, are there for Morrison to minimise this sort of behaviour? Jimmy Bye is sort of asking, are there any other incentives, other than just purely winning votes for him to change how he goes about things?
Yeah, I think in a way, look, despite everything I've written about complacency and Australians' complacency, and I do think that's a real strain in our character, I also think that there is an ongoing hunger for government and good government. I think it's often outweighed by our willingness to switch off politics and not pay much attention. But the growth in disillusionment in politics over the past 2 decades, we know it's there. It shows up in polling. It's huge. It's a massive trend, a massively important trend. I think does point to its opposite as well, which is that people would love to see our politicians doing substantive things. And so I do think that if Morrison can act in a substantive fashion, if he can govern well, then that is a path to redemption of his character problems, if you like. Now that is one path. The other path, in a sense, is to double down. The easier path, if you like, is to double down. Now, one of the things that it's worth remembering about Scott Morrison at this point in the political cycle is that he has suffered enormous character damage. He has had 3 very sustained, damaging political periods this year, and yet his approval ratings are still not disastrous. They are far above some periods that John Howard went through before recovering to win elections. And Scott Morrison might not be nearly as substantive nor as clever a politician as John Howard was, but he's also not as down in the polls as John Howard was at times. So I think it's worth remembering the damage. I think he has sustained significant damage, but I don't think it's as great as everybody, as a lot of people think it is. But if his polling is saying it is a real problem, then I think, perhaps optimistically, I like to think that one of the fixes would be to pursue some policy and to govern in a stable way, and that would be a good thing. That would be a good thing, and if a party wins an election by doing those 2 things, then that is largely a good thing as well, or at least it is a reason that a party can be said to deserve re-election.
Right. While we've been talking, Mark Zernsak has actually gone directly to a Morrison policy initiative, and he speaks of what he describes as Morrison's actions to make the online world a safer place. And he asks, why shouldn't we see this as a genuine objective and something that he's deep down seriously willing to fight for?
Well, I guess 2 things. The first is I think we're going to need to see a lot more in it before we can reach the conclusion that he's really serious about it. Because I think, because to come back here, Scott Morrison's been in government 3 years, or a little, about 3 years, and in that time, I can't recall a thing that he has faced political difficulty over that he has stuck by. You look at, for example, the industrial relations laws, and you can mount arguments against them. They certainly weren't as radical as things that have been attempted in the past, and they gave up on them pretty quickly, really. So I think that's the first point. It's not necessarily that Scott Morrison doesn't have beliefs. He does have beliefs. I don't think he's an entirely empty guy at all. I think he does believe in things. I just don't think he seems to believe in things enough to be willing to fight for them. So I think we have to wait a little while before that one is tested. I do think, to this worldview idea I was talking about before, he does have a kind of stitched together series of beliefs around respect. Lack of respect is the problem with our modern society, he argues. And he, in some ways, he seems to tie identity politics to this. And then he thinks that social media is is a big problem there because it promotes lack of respect and is tied to identity politics. It's a little bit mixed up, but yeah, I don't doubt that there is some part of him that is sincere in that pursuit. Doesn't mean there's not a political side to it, of course, but that's true of any politician.
Fair enough. Angus Robinson made the point that when Gough Whitlam came to power, he swept away years of Conservative government by what Angus describes as exposing the do-nothing politics of the Menzies era and Menzies' subsequent successors, and contrasting it with a program of substantive reform right across the political spectrum. But the counterpoint, as Angus says, was this, of course, provoked some fairly concentrated and intense resistance, but in a range of pockets, which ultimately led to Gough's downfall. And Angus is wondering, whether this still plays out today in the response of, for example, today's opposition to Morrison, that it's caused progressive politicians to be very reluctant to challenge the notion of do-nothing politics, of rocking the boat, as it were.
I think that there's no question that Labor MPs have been scarred by Whitlam losing power so quickly, and then they feel as though they should model themselves on the Hawke-Keating model. But I mean, of course, Hawke and Keating did an enormous amount in their first 3 years. I mean, that's actually the thing about most governments. Most governments do an enormous amount in their first 3 years and then tend to slow. Scott Morrison's government may end up being the opposite. I suppose we'll find out. I think it is true that Whitlam, I wrote about this last week. Whitlam talked in his campaign launch speech about there being a backlog of work, and Rudd, in a way, made a similar point when he was running for election in 2007. He announced a bunch of policies, and they were essentially things that Howard, perhaps should have done, but hadn't done. And in some ways, that's why Labor gets elected at certain points. If we talk about the complacency of the Australian character, Liberal governments are, in a way, I think, they certainly see themselves this way, that the natural match for Australia a lot of the time. And then there is a backlog of things. There is a clear need to push the country forward again. And that's when Australians think, hang on, we need a shift. We need Labor to come in and shake things up and do some things. And then Labor needs to make that case that there is that backlog of things to do. I think to the question, I guess the issue then becomes how quickly Labor tries to do those things. And I think Labor MPs are always going to be a little bit torn, and I can completely understand why, between thinking, well, we need to go gradually in the hope that we can get as many years as the Hawke-Keating government did, because the longer you are around, the more you change the country, because the more chance you have of the policies you deliver being embedded in the fibre of the nation. And thinking, well, one way or another, the nation's going to kick us out in 6 years. So we need to get a bloody move on. And I think those two strands are always pulling at each other in Labor.
Yep. If Labor finds itself tugged by the strand that it might be too risky to put too many policy cards on the table, how much profit is there for a Labor opposition to go after Morrison very hard in character terms, in essence, call him out for not being complacent, but go in very hard and use terms like liar, etc., etc. Is that likely to be effective, or is it likely to be counterproductive, or is it something that you would do in concert, as it were, with a more positive agenda?
I mean, look, let me say first up, I don't know. It's a really strange electoral cycle. It's a really strange electoral cycle because of COVID. It's a really strange electoral cycle because there have been 3 Liberal prime ministers. It's not really clear whether there's a sense of this being an old government or still quite a new government, with the Morrison government being the newish government, if you like. So I think it's really unclear. Labor at the moment seem to be, they're starting to put some policies out. I'm sure that we'll see more. I don't know to what extent they're banking on policies to bring them home, or to what extent they're banking on Morrison's popularity problems to bring them home. And I don't know to what extent they can. I genuinely think it's a very strange electoral cycle, and I'm definitely not making any predictions. I think that you will see a mix of those two things. That's not a very controversial prediction of trying to tell people what they stand for via policy and trying to tear Morrison down. My own feeling is that they've spent a lot of time trying to tear Morrison down. The conditions have probably been about as good for Labor in that sense as you can imagine, in terms of the mistakes Morrison's made in the last 6 months. I think that my own feeling is that Labor probably needs to tell the electorate what the alternative is now very clearly, because I guess the way what I think has happened is that Morrison's problems have opened a door. As a government, you hope that door never opens, where people begin to look at the other side. I think people are willing to look at the other side now. I certainly don't think they've decided to walk through that door yet, and that's what the election is going to be all about now. Morrison trying to keep them on one side of that door, and Labor trying to beckon them through on the other.
Mm-hmm. We've spoken a lot about the purely Australian context, but we've had some, interesting things happen overseas. I mean, first of all, there was the Biden victory. Norway, another resources-rich country, has seen a return to the Norwegian Labour Party. After a couple of goes at it, the Swedes seem to have formed a progressive government, and of course there's been a new coalition in Germany. Are there any lessons that we can draw from any of those changes?
Look, I think it's tricky. I think it's tricky partly because of timing. So if you look at the Biden election, of course, there are lots of unique elements of that particular American election. But one of them in relation to our election is that it took place at a different phase of COVID. It took place at a point where people were still talking about the lessons that might be learned from COVID, and the opportunities that open up, if you like, the problems it spotlighted that people should try to fix. Whereas I think the Australian election will probably take place in a different context, or will take place in the context in which we are all sick to death of COVID and sick to death of talking about COVID, which is why at this point you see both sides trying to tread pretty softly. Labor's slogan recently, renewal not revolution, I think is probably a pretty good encapsulation of the way people are feeling, in the same way that Scott Morrison's take on it being, get government out of people's lives. They are different ways of saying similar things with slightly different emphases, and that just tells you that that's what they're picking up from focus groups, from polling. That probably is the mood of the nation. So I think that's the first important thing to realise about trying to draw lessons from other elections in other countries, the timing difficulty. The second thing is, I was reading a piece in the New York Times. I think it was about the German leader and talking about how much he had studied, genuinely, how much time he had spent studying what had happened in the last 2 years in the US and the UK, and really trying to read and think his way to solutions. And I think that's a good lesson for for the Labor Party and the Liberal Party. And it kind of comes back to what I was saying earlier, which is that you have to treat politics seriously. You have to think very carefully about the interaction of policies with the time and with where the electorate is at, and you have to do the work on that. So I guess I would say to any political party, the lesson to be drawn from the victories of your corresponding parties in other nations. I don't have those lessons, but they should be studied. I don't know, David, you would have a better sense than me of whether Labor people are spending a great deal of time looking at those victories. I certainly think the Conservatives paid a great deal of attention. Conservatives across the world paid a great deal of attention to what happened in Donald Trump's election, and I think perhaps they did in the way that we all did. But that has certainly had a massive influence on the way Conservatives fight elections around the world.
Yeah. Well, just moving a bit further on elections, because regardless of which major party wins the lower house, we've got the Senate. And Dimitri Burstein's pointed to this while we've been talking. And he says that, there's potential parallels for, from the mid to late 70s in terms of the Senate, where, notwithstanding Malcolm Fraser gaining control of the Senate, he didn't necessarily have control of his own party within the Senate. There was a substantial minority of Liberal wets who, not regularly, but on significant occasions, crossed the floor. But regardless of that, Malcolm Fraser and for a brief period John Howard are the only recent prime ministers who've prevailed in the Senate. So it's highly unlikely in the current circumstances that anyone's going to wield control of the Senate, obviously in their own right, and probably not much less unlikely, to use some clumsy phrasing, that anyone's going to firm up a firm coalition in the Senate. So where does that take us? And of the two major parties, which is the one better placed to negotiate their way through the likely outcome in the Senate?
Look, I don't have a good answer to either of those questions. I do think there is a question that's kind of hovering over that, which I touched on a little bit earlier in terms of the division between the widening gap between the moderates and the Conservatives in the Liberal Party, which is that I think too much is sometimes made of crises within parties and identity crises, but nevertheless, I do think it is true that both the Labor Party and the Liberal Party are facing politics at a time of real change in politics, the way politics is conducted, but also a reorientation of the electorates that tend to vote for each of those parties. I think that is making things difficult for each of those parties in different ways. I don't need to rehearse those difficulties, but I think the fact that each of them are increasingly having to try to play to different audiences, or to put it another way, haven't figured out who their main base of voters is or should be in the future, means that Senate, trying to win votes in the Senate, I think becomes a really tricky exercise, because you often risk going down choosing an identity for your party. So you saw this recently with Scott Morrison, playing footsie with the protesters in Melbourne. He should have been much sharper and much harsher and faster out of the gates, or at least he should not have been qualified in his condemnation of them. But part of the reason, surely, was the fact that he was trying to win the votes of some of these far-right parties in the Senate. And that, I don't think he should have done that, but I think it points to the difficulty that any leader is going to face in trying to win those voters. He didn't just, create a media storm for a couple of days. He sends a sense of where the Liberal Party is in the two halves of the party that are fighting for dominance. And, Labor often faces very similar battles in terms of, the centre right of the party and the greener half of it, if you like. And I think that's what makes the battles in the Senate more and more complicated and more interesting.
Mm-hmm. We might step right back from the politics and the election side of things and go back to the craft of the writer. And just as a final question to you, Sean, you've had to rely very heavily on the transcripted Morrison and on secondary sources. Do you think there will ever be a time when someone other than Morrison himself can take a more traditional, deeper approach in terms of direct interviews, etc., to write a biography of Morrison? Will that ever happen?
Yes. I think probably in two different ways. Morrison has annoyed a lot of people within his party, and so everyone, and he's quite a strong leader within his party, as in he has quite a lot of authority. I think the moment he loses an election, certainly if he loses the next election, I think you'll see a lot of people wanting to tell their side of the story to people, which I think will be interesting. So yeah, I definitely think there will be a lot of access in the future, and Morrison, like most subjects of biographies, I think will learn that he needs to provide his own side of the story, or he'll get run over by others, run over by other stories. So yes, and I think I think that will be interesting, an oral history of the Morrison government, or just a straight biography. At that point, I think will be really interesting. Some of that's possible already. Annika Smethurst's book has people talking quite candidly about Morrison, and some of what they have to say is really, really interesting. Yeah. I don't know if that's much of an answer. Sorry, David.
No, that's all right. No, I think you make some fair points. I also suspect it's a little bit hard to predict at the moment, and I wouldn't want to press you too much on it. But I just find it an interesting question, and a question I've never seen arise as far as other recent prime ministers go. There's never been a shortage, and indeed there doesn't remain a shortage in the case of at least two of them about them wanting to say something, and nor has there been a shortage of others wanting to say things sort of on the record. But in the case of Morrison, we seem to see a fair bit of it, even allowing for the fact that he's still a leader, and a powerful leader within his own party. Yeah.
The other thing I'd very quickly say is that I think the subject of any non-fiction book chooses the form for you in a way. And so I ended up writing a book that relies on transcripts because I think that is the important, for me, I think that is the important thing about Morrison. I think the important thing about him is the performance he gives, and that is visible in he makes. Times in the writing of this book that I really strongly considered trying to write a very different book, considered trying to do a whole bunch of interviews, considered trying to get access to Morrison, and I didn't do those things in the end, because I decided that the nature of Morrison as a politician meant that the story that I was interested in was elsewhere, and the story that I think is important about Morrison. So I think for me at least, Morrison shows his own form.
Yeah. It sounds like to me, if we were to consider it in New Yorker terms, that he's a person who lends himself to the Janet Malcolm approach rather than the John McPhee approach.
I think that's a good description. Yeah.
Mm. On that note, Sean, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. It's been a fascinating conversation. For those of you who haven't read it, do read it. It's one of the most readable political biographies that I've come across in recent years. And I don't think I'm the only one to say it. In fact, a number of my friends have said that to me. A bit of a plug. If you choose to get it online through the publisher, we do have a Chifley discount code, so you can give yourself a bit of a Christmas discount. This is our last Chifley conversation for the year, and I'd just like to thank everyone who's joined us tonight and also joined us through the series. And I'd also like to thank the Chifley board for supporting these conversations. And silently in the background, I'd like to thank Daisy Jeffries, who's been helping put them together and manage the logistics. So good night from us, and we'll see you all next year.